Good morning. I'd like to welcome you to my spring garden. I'm Joan McKinnon, and we did a tour of my garden last July, but it's a very different garden in the spring. Right now I've got ground phlox coming out. I've got these candy cane tulips, they start out pretty nearly white and then they turn redder and redder as time goes on. And these ones have actually lasted about 8 or 9 years. If I can find some more, I'd plant more around the other side, but for some reason I can't find them. I love my spring bulbs, and so I start out with Iris reticulata and little species tulips, which are now pretty well over with. But we've still got lots of daffodils, even despite the snow that we had a couple of weeks ago, which pushed them down pretty well, but lots more came up. And then the tulips are now all coming out. A lot of the tulips in this area are ones that I planted last year. My color theme is pink and white, but it's amazing how things turn up that aren't quite in the color theme. Like this one right in the middle, which I'm sure I didn't plant, and I would guess perhaps one of my friendly squirrels in the neighborhood moved it for me. Next is going to come the irises, the little ones first, and then it moves on to the bigger irises later on, the bigger bearded ones. Everything's doing well this year. It's maybe a little ahead of where it is normally because it was very warm in early April. Lately it's been cooler and we've had a lot of rain over the last little while, which we desperately needed. So then we're going to move around the house. We'll go up through this area where I've got some shrubs and some more daffodils and tulips. Quite a lot of the daffodils in this area have been here just about as long as I've lived here, which is 11 years. And these ones I brought with me from my former house. So by last year, I realized that they were getting pretty crowded. And in the fall, I dug up the patch of these, thinking I might get, 50 or 60 bulbs. I ended up with 220 bulbs out of that one patch. So I replanted about 10 in that area. I took 60 down to the horticultural park, and I now have clumps of these around other parts of the garden as well. So it's amazing how daffodils will multiply if they're in an area that they like. This is another area where I've planted a lot of mainly tulips. I have some daffodils, but primarily tulips, and I'm trying to go for oranges and reds in this area. This is my daylily garden, and so it needs some color in the spring. It'll be nice and bright later on in the summer, but right now it doesn't have much. And then I also have some miniature roses around the edge, which did quite well over this last winter, which wasn't as severe as normal. This is an interesting plant. It's called Lamyastrum or Archangel. It has yellow flowers. It spreads a little bit, but it's not bad. But I have to admit, I'm actually going to get rid of it because I want to plant more daylilies. Daylilies are my love, so they have to have a bit more room than they've got right now. This is an interesting little plant. It's a purple Coridolis. It's one of those plants that you can only get from a friend. You will never find it in a nursery plant store because they're an ephemeral. They're a little bulb. They come up early. They're one of the very first things that blooms in my garden. They have these pretty little purple flowers. Some of them are more pink than purple. And once they stop blooming, which is just about now, they will disappear. And you literally will not be able to see them again until next spring, which is why you just can't sell them because you can't find them. There's another type that is starting to bloom over in this upper garden, which is a yellow Coridolis, and it blooms all summer. It blooms sun and shade. It does tend to self-seed a little aggressively, but it's really easy to pull out. And because it blooms all summer long, I just leave it. We've moved into the backyard under this very shady maple tree. Every spring I debate with myself, should I clean it up or should I leave the leaves pretty much as they are? And I try and persuade myself that I really should leave them because I know that by about the end of June they will have disintegrated. And this area, the soil isn't particularly great, so having a little more humus added to it is always a good thing. But there's this other part of me that always says it should look neat and tidy, so I have a war every time I come back here. So far, the side for leaving has won. I have some woodland plants like these Trilliums, and this year they've done well. I've had this patch for probably 8 or 9 years, and finally they're starting to clump up. They're starting to look like something. And there's also one that has decided to move itself right over by the little wall over there. I assume it just self-seeded. We've got some Virginia Bluebell. The bloodroot is pretty much over for now. And then there's wild ginger in here. I haven't planted any of my pots. I brought the pots out from inside because I take them in every fall so that they don't crack and get wrecked in the fall. But it's been too chilly to plant them with the annuals. So that'll be a task for probably about 2 weeks from now. One of my favorite spring plants is Brunera, and I have quite a few different ones. It looks almost exactly like a forget-me-not in terms of its flowers, but it doesn't pop up everywhere. The leaves are attractive. It's quite a tidy little plant. This one is the variety Jack Frost, which has really lovely silvery leaves. I've also got a lot of pulmonaria in here, or lungwort, and again, it's got pretty leaves that look attractive right throughout the summer, and it blooms for a long time. It often starts blooming about the beginning of April, and it'll probably bloom through much of May. So it's a good one to plant in a shady garden, and it'll even grow in more sunshine than I've got here. This is an interesting summer bulb. It's called Cujum. It's also sometimes called summer snowflake because it looks a lot like a snowdrop, except much taller. People sometimes ask why I've got it at the front. Well, it's going to die back, and it gives me a nice bit of contrasting color here right at the front. The bleeding hearts are just starting. I've got a couple that are normal, everyday, ordinary bleeding hearts. And I also have this one back here, which is called Gold Heart. And it's a lovely variety that keeps its leaves through the summer, and it gives a lot of bright contrast to the rest of the garden for a long time. The Hellebores are still blooming. I'm always amazed that they will start beginning of April usually, and the ones in the top in particular will bloom until probably June. These two up here, that was the parent plant on the right. That is its offspring, and both of them send up seedlings every year, which I distribute to people around and about. So this whole area is going to be full of white Hellebores that have come from these two. They're very reliable, and they are a little more upright than some varieties of Hellebore, which tend to have nodding flowers like this one. This one's interesting, but the flower is bent right over. This one's a pretty one. It's called French Kiss. Unfortunately, some of these fancier varieties don't seem to have seedlings, at least not the same way that these ones up here do. The herbs are starting to come up. We've got lemon balm, and all of the different mints are coming up. This is Lovage. Most of my thymes made it through the winter, and most of my lavender also. They always look a little scraggly at this point, but they'll come along later. And then I have a combination of red and yellow tulips up in this bed. There are also about half a dozen rose bushes in there because it gets a nice amount of sun, at least in the mornings. The primroses have all come out. And I also have some white Brunera, which is a nice contrast right back in here. This one's white Brunera, and I've got a couple more, this one as well. The Solomon seal is coming up. And this is the other little Trillium that self-seeded itself. So I'll leave it for a while and then I may bring it back over to its original group. This is my main rose garden, but of course I also get tempted in the fall to fill in the spaces with tulips and daffodils. The daffodils here are still blooming nicely. Most of my roses made it through the winter. This large one here is a David Austin rose called the crocus. And once it starts blooming in June, it basically blooms until frost without a break. It's an amazing rose. Some of the other ones are also David Austin's, and this is one of the Canadian Artists series called Bill Reed, which has done pretty well for me too. This garden's always been a mix of sun and shade. Shade pretty much on this side and more sun over here. And so on this side it's primarily hostas, and on this side I've got some daylilies and other plants. However, this past March we had to have an ash tree taken down. It was a fairly large one. Unfortunately, it had emerald ash borer, which is a real scourge in this area. And they're dangerous when they get really affected by it because they get very brittle. So we had it taken down. I don't know what the effect of that's going to be on this garden. I may end up having to move a lot of these hostas over the summertime. I'll always find a space somewhere. This part of the garden's pretty well full sun. May even get a little more sun now that the ash tree's down. And it's absolutely full of daffodils. Originally, those are starting to go, though we still have a couple of patches in bloom. And then it transitions over to the tulips. And primarily, it's really deep colors. It's primarily purples and oranges. Now, sometimes what they called orange in the store turns out to be more red or pink, like those. Nevertheless, I like the combination of the purples and the oranges in here. And then it goes through a phase in May when it is much more gentle and subdued, primarily purples and whites. But then once the daylilies come out, it turns back into a bright and colorful garden again. So it goes through phases. This area gets a lot more shade than sun, and for that reason I don't tend to have a lot of bulbs in here. I always get tempted in the fall to put a few more in, but they typically only last for maybe one season. So these are ones that I probably planted last fall. This area is mostly hostas, some daylilies. I've got some Siberian iris in here. And I just planted this rhododendron, which is called Olga Mazet. It came from Rita Woodland Ramble, and they specialize in rhododendrons that are more suitable for our area. I also have some phlox. This area is sunnier than this area, and so I've got phlox in here. And if you notice this little patch of tiny daffodils, this one and one over there are ones that I bought at Metro, probably last winter or the winter before, saved it for the rest of the winter, and then put out. And as you can see, they come back. So it's well worth saving your daffodils that you got to cheer up your table in February, because they will come back again in another year if you keep them alive. This is a very interesting daffodil. It's a split corona, and it's a really pretty one. If you bought it from Breck's, they'd probably call it a pink one. I don't think it's pink. I'd call it peach, but it doesn't matter. It's still a pretty daffodil. There's still some tulips about to come out in here, and the alliums are starting to grow. These are giant alliums, and so they'll be out in probably another 3 weeks perhaps. So the whole area will be completely full. It gets to the point where I have trouble walking through this garden because it's got so many plants in it. I always think I have room in the spring to plant a few more things, and then realize that no, I shouldn't have. Oh well.